All right, everyone, this is video part two to review for the second quiz. Be sure you watch the first one. Before this, the first one's going to talk about the 1973 war, also known as the Yom Kippur War, and it will also talk about the Camp David Accords. So we're going to talk a little bit more about settlements. We did talk about them before quiz one, but let's talk about how settlements are expanding beginning in the 1970s and how that's going to add to the complexity of this conflict and make it more difficult to reach a peace agreement. So, as you remember from before quiz one, the settlements were initially built by Israeli civilians. Most of them were more Zionist. They believed that there was a biblical significance in the West Bank, too. That's because the ancient hills of Judea and Samaria are within the West Bank. And so they start to move there increasingly after the 1967 war, when this territory was controlled by the Israeli military. They build homes there ultimately to make this also a Jewish area. Their ultimate goal potentially was to create or to expand rather the Jewish state into the West Bank, also Gaza for that matter. But the settlements were much more prominent in the West Bank than they were in Gaza, and we'll talk about Gaza in a future video. But increasingly over time, it's not just Zionists that are moving to the settlements. And one of the reasons why that is because they were very appealing suburban homes for people who were commuting to Jerusalem for work. They were typically more affordable than living in Jerusalem. And they were also very accessible to Jerusalem because of the freeways that were constructed, the flyover roads that bypassed the Palestinian areas and took people straight into either Jerusalem or also other parts of Israel. The Israeli government argued that it was justifiable because there was no Palestinian state per se, that even though the West Bank was territory the Palestinians lived in after the 1967 war, it was occupied by the Israeli military. Um, so so that's essentially why they said that those settlements were allowed. Once the 1970s roll around, after the Camp David Accords, when Begin was prime minister, he actually makes it easier for these settlements to be constructed. So the 70s is sort of a shift in the Israeli government's approach towards the settlements. Increasingly, the Israeli government is actually actively assisting the construction of settlements and actively encouraging its citizens to move there. So that's a big change, and that also is going to really impact the Palestinian response to the growth of the settlements. They will increasingly feel threatened because they will be surrounded by an Israeli presence, and they will feel that as an increased sign of a loss of land. The international community, particularly the United Nations, tends to argue that these settlements are not legal. The UN issued a resolution number 2334, I think it was, that said these settlements were illegal. But the issue there is it's very difficult to actually enforce a UN resolution. And the other reason why it's difficult is the United States government has been a little bit more friendly towards the Israeli government, and I don't want to say the entire United States government. It does depend on who is in the White House and who controls the majority of seats in the Senate and the House during a particular time period. But for simplicity's sake, in general, the United States government has taken a slightly different approach towards settlements and has been a little bit more favorable towards the Israeli government side of the narrative. I hope that makes sense. Um, so I think for the most part that explains settlements, at least for now. At this point, I think it's a little higher than this now. This is as of 2017-ish. There were almost a half a million settlers living in the West Bank. You can sort of see how, especially, I mean, really after the 1970s, how precipitously uh, the number of settlers increases in the Palestinian territories. Okay, so let's talk about the First Intifada. It actually was, in many ways, a reaction to the Camp David Accords, even though the Camp David Accords were way back in 1978. But I'll explain why it takes that long for the Intifada to break out in just a minute. Now, the immediate causes are less paramount for you to know for the quiz. I'll just talk about those really briefly. Okay, so just a few events start in the end of 1987. Be aware that this is not just a one-year affair. This was a long event. So was the Second Intifada. So if you were in F period, we did annotated timelines today. In A period, we'll do those tomorrow. Tomorrow is Friday. So just be aware that we'll get a better sense of how this narrative all fits together once we do that review activity. So anyway, first there was an Israeli Jew who was shopping and was killed by a Palestinian in a public place, right, in Gaza. Then afterward, there was a vehicle crash. An Israeli military vehicle ran off the road, and 4 Palestinians were struck by that vehicle and killed. And the reason why that was a cause of the Intifada was that the responses, the interpretation of that car crash was different depending on what side of the narrative these voices were on. So the Israeli government said it was an accident, but many Palestinians argue that it was deliberate, that this car deliberately ran into Palestinians and had them killed. And the Intifada itself began when many protesters, Palestinian protesters, gathered together to protest the incident. There was an Israeli military presence there. Protesters started to pick up stones and throw them at Israeli military officers, and then some of the Israeli military officers returned fire. And that's what kicks it off. So in general, of course, it was a long event, but the Intifada, we talked about it in class. Intifada does not mean uprising. It means more like shaking something off, shedding an identity. So in a lot of ways, they called it the Intifada rather than an uprising because they saw it as a way for them to sort of shed this Israeli presence. They wanted the West Bank and Gaza for themselves, and they resented that every day that they would go to work, go to school, they would see IDF soldiers. And so that's why they were picking up the stones and throwing them at the soldiers. And one of the reasons why we see this, well, actually, the next slide talks about how many people were killed. So I'll save that for a second. Forgive me, sidetracked. So anyway, some of the strategies, they were not entirely violent. There was a lot of civil disobedience, protest, boycotting Israeli businesses, uh, right, drawing graffiti in certain areas, blocking off streets. And you can compare that to some of our discussions earlier in the year about different forms of protest. You can see that in some ways, in the earlier stages of the Intifada, there was an attempt to keep their protest nonviolent. But increasingly, as they became frustrated, they started to resort to more aggressive means to try to essentially make their voices heard and attempt to rid the Israeli presence in the West Bank and Gaza. But we know that that's very difficult, of course, because I mean, look, this picture sort of says it all, right? This is a sort of a David and Goliath type image. So that's one of the reasons why you know we can explain some of these fatality rates in the next slide. At first, right, they actually really tried to not use weapons. The stones were seen as symbolic more that ultimately when they used the stones they knew they weren't going to kill people, but they wanted to just show the Israeli military that they did not like their presence there. That's why they used stones. um, and they also did start to use more violent methods. Molotov cocktails, we talked about what those were, so I'm not going to explain them on this video. I'm trying to keep these short. But then as the Intifada drags on, again, that's why it's important that it lasts a while. Palestinians do start to shoot, they do start to stab at Israelis, and that will actually make the Israeli military response more aggressive as well. So, of course, we're not going to watch this video. That is for you. Be aware if you watch it on campus at Chadwick, you may not be able to see it. So watch it at home if that happens. So the defense minister at the time basically called on the military to really squash the Intifada with whatever force necessary. And because, I mean, this was a very confusing event too. It's important for us to realize that the IDF soldiers are very young. These are people not much older than you. So the soldiers even were very frightened and not sure how to respond in many instances. So they returned fire, and I mean, their superior weapons, the precise accuracy of some of their weapons made it so that the death toll was much higher on the Palestinian side. These numbers speak for themselves. I'm not going to go through them. And also, as time went on in the Intifada, the IDF, the Israeli military, also used the practice of targeted killings. We saw that before during the British Mandate period. The British military did this. But what they were trying to do was they were trying to kill the leaders of the Intifada. Um, but ultimately, these targeted killings, they were officially denied by the Israeli government because they didn't want to be accused of war crimes by, the United Nations or The Hague. So about 100 Israeli civilians were killed by Palestinians, and in the crossfire, oh no, I'm sorry, civilians and then IDF officers, the death was about 60. but many more were injured. So this was a very calamitous event for whatever side of the conflict the various parties were on. Okay, and then tons of Palestinians arrested, many of them detained in Israeli prisons afterward. Let's see what time it is. Okay, we have time for a little bit more, maybe. Okay, so how did the first Intifada? Not how did it end, but what was the aftermath? Well, one thing that's important is that the PLO is going to shift tactics a little bit. So Yasser Arafat realizes that the way to go moving forward doesn't seem to be by an intifada or a mass uprising. He realizes that that had a very violent end, and he tries, at least in this stage, to extend an olive branch to Israel, or at least one through his words. And what I mean by that is he does speak before the United Nations. He says the PLO recognizes the state of Israel, which is a major step. Think about the Camp David Accords in the previous video. When Egypt recognized Israel, this was seen as a huge shift in Arab-Israeli affairs. Same thing could be said with this. But he did also, this is a complex statement. He says he recognized Israel, but he also declared an independent Palestinian state in both the West Bank and Gaza. But then he also says, I denounce terrorism as a tactic towards really protecting this Palestinian state. So you can see that this is a complex statement. He's really trying to say, Israel, we recognize you, but we also recognize Palestine. And now this leads to also a division within the PLO because Hamas, a rather new faction within the PLO, which was more anti-Israel, more willing to use violent means to achieve this goal of a Palestinian state, many of them reject Yasser Arafat's approach. And that's going to be one of the reasons moving forward why we're going to see that when Hamas rises in prominence, this makes this conflict much more difficult, much more complicated. But I think we should probably stop it there. I'm looking at time. It looks like E period's going to start soon. So we will pick up in the third video on the Oslo Accords. Stay tuned. It may not be recorded until Friday, but I will make sure everything's good to go by the start of the weekend so you have plenty of time to study. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned and thanks.